Hello and welcome back. In this Black Excellist presentation, we want to celebrate the Buffalo Soldiers, the all-black trailblazers of the Wild West.
Welcome to blackexcellist.com, the site where we share Black excellence, opulence, and affluence. Our mission is to inspire you as we enlighten you.
The story of the early all-black regiments that served in the U.S. Army is intriguing and important. They were pioneers in post-slavery America, staking their claims on citizenship by serving their country and doing so in spite of the racism, humiliation, and limitation of ranks. Once the Westward movement began, the black soldiers who blazed the treacherous trails of the Wild West were referred to as the Buffalo Soldiers of the U.S. Army. These African Americans were charged with and responsible for escorting settlers, cattle herds, and railroad crews, but also fought in campaigns against American Indian tribes before serving as some of the first American park rangers. In this original Black Excellist video, we will be featuring the Buffalo Soldiers, the brave African American soldiers of the United States Army. So without further ado, let's get started. Number 1. The Buffalo Soldiers were formed in 1866 following the Civil War. Buffalo Soldiers originally were members of the 10th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army, formed on September 21, 1866 at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Buffalo Soldiers were African American soldiers who mainly served on the western frontier following the American Civil War. There were 6 all-black cavalry and infantry regiments that were created after Congress passed the Army Organization Act. Their main tasks were to help control the Native Americans of the plains, capture cattle rustlers and thieves, and protect settlers, stagecoaches, wagon trains, and railroad crews along the Western Front. Number 2. The Native Americans nicknamed the all-black regiments Buffalo Soldiers. No one knows for certain how Native Americans came to nickname the all-black 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments Buffalo Soldiers. According to the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum, the name originated with the Cheyenne warriors in the winter of 1877. However, other sources attributed the nickname to the Apache, who used the term to refer to their dark, curly, kinky hair that resembled the bison's. Others claim that possible sources could be from the Plains Indians, who gave them that nickname because of the bison coats they wore in winter. The best and more common explanation is that the Native Americans recognized the bravery in these soldiers and how they fought valiantly and fiercely. And since the mighty buffalo was a sacred animal to the Indian, they nicknamed their enemy the Buffalo Soldiers out of revere and respect. The term Buffalo Soldiers has now become a generic term for all black soldiers. It is now used for U.S. Army units that trace their direct lineage back to any of the African American regiments formed in 1866. Number 3. The Buffalo Soldiers fought in most military campaigns in the Southwest. From 1866 to the early 1890s, the Buffalo Soldiers served at a variety of posts in the southwestern United States and Great Plains regions. Both the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments participated in dozens upon dozens of skirmishes and larger battles of the Indian Wars as America became obsessed with westward expansion. They participated in most of the military campaigns in these areas and earned a distinguished record. For instance, the 9th Cavalry was critical to the success of a 3-month unremitting campaign known as the Red River War against the Kiowas, the Comanches, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. The 10th Cavalry continued to control the Apache attacks until the early 1890s when they relocated to Montana. Number 4. The Buffalo Soldiers' role in the Indian Wars is complicated. Much attention is given to the irony of African American soldiers fighting Native people on behalf of an American government with little respect for either group. The role that the Buffalo Soldiers played in the white settlers' westward expansion into lands inhabited by indigenous people is complicated and controversial. The Buffalo Soldiers protected white settlers and were instrumental in building and patrolling the infrastructure that would eventually displace the Native Americans by force and violence. Some can argue that the Buffalo Soldiers were an effective but unaware instrument of the U.S. government to pave the way west for displacing indigenous Americans and opening up the West for white Americans. Still, one should resist the temptation to desecrate the complex role of segregated black regiments in Western history. In addition to protecting white settlers, the Buffalo Soldiers were also given missions to protect the Native Americans from white settlers. By 1880, the 9th and 10th Cavalry were given orders to defend Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek farmers from Comanche or Kiowa raids, and even defended indigenous tribes from illegal settlers taking over their land. About 20% of U.S. cavalry troops that participated in the Indian Wars were Buffalo Soldiers, who participated in at least 177 conflicts. Number 5. Buffalo Soldiers served in international wars in Mexico and Philippines. After most of the Indian Wars ended in the 1890s, the Buffalo Soldier regiments continued to serve, and at least 5,000 participated in the 1898 Spanish-American War in Alabama, Illinois, Kansas, North Carolina, Ohio, and Virginia, including the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba. Additionally, there was a company of African-American soldiers that saw action in Puerto Rico. The Buffalo Soldiers regiments also took part in the Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1903 and the 1916 Mexican Expedition. In 1918, the 10th Cavalry fought at the Battle of Ambos Nogales during the First World War, where they assisted in forcing the surrender of the federal Mexican and Mexican militia forces. Buffalo Soldiers fought in the last engagement of the Indian Wars, the small Battle of Bear Valley in southern Arizona, which occurred in 1918 between U.S. cavalry and Yaqui natives. Number 6. Buffalo Soldiers served as the nation's first park rangers. Buffalo Soldiers did not only fight in wars, they served as some of the first national park rangers. In between 1891 and 1913, about 500 Buffalo Soldiers earned coveted roles as protectors of Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. In 1899, Buffalo Soldiers served in Yosemite National Park, Sequoia National Park, and General Grant National Parks. They also fought wildfires and poachers in Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks and supported the park's infrastructure. The Buffalo Soldiers found themselves working on the western frontier because African Americans could only serve west of the Mississippi River, because many whites didn't want to see armed black soldiers in or near their communities. They built roads, acted as park rangers, and fought in battles to defend American westward expansion. In 1903, 9th Cavalrymen in Sequoia built the first trail to the top of Mount Whitney, the highest mountain in the contiguous United States. They also built the first wagon road into Sequoia's giant forest, the most famous grove of giant sequoia trees in Sequoia National Park. In 1904, 9th Cavalrymen in Yosemite built an arboretum on the South Fork of the Merced River in the southern section of the park. The arboretum has pathways and benches, and some plants were identified in both English and Latin. Yosemite's arboretum is considered to be the first museum in the national park system. Number 7. Racism played a major role in diminishing the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers were often confronted with racial prejudice from other members of the U.S. Army. Because of racism, they often received the worst food, worst equipment, and the worst treatment from their commanders and from civilians. Civilians in the areas where the soldiers were stationed occasionally reacted to them with violence as they were attacked during racial disturbances. During the Indian Wars from 1866 to 1891, 416 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. Although the Buffalo Soldiers comprised 12% of the U.S. Army infantry force, Buffalo Soldiers were awarded less than 4% of all medals of honor awarded. White commanders were reticent to award their bravery and victories with awards, medals, and promotions to higher ranks, and more often than not, black captains and lieutenants were assigned to all-black regiments or relegated to remote outposts to help reduce their visibility and authority. Discrimination continued to play a role in diminishing the Buffalo Soldiers' involvement in the major World War conflicts. During World War I, the racist policies of President Woodrow Wilson led to black regiments being excluded from the American Expeditionary Force and placed under French command for the duration of the war. The first time ever that American troops had been put under the command of a foreign power. Number 8. The Smokey Bear Hat was a trend started by the Buffalo Soldiers. A lasting legacy of the soldiers as park rangers is the Ranger hat, popularly known as the Smokey Bear Hat. Although not officially adopted by the Army until 1911, the distinctive hat crease or pinch, called a Montana peak, can be seen being worn by several of the Buffalo Soldiers in park photographs dating back to 1899. Soldiers serving in the Spanish-American War began to recrease the Stetson hat with a Montana pinch to better shed water from the torrential tropical rains. Many retained that distinctive crease upon their return to the U.S. Number 9. The Buffalo Soldiers served bravely, and at least 3 graduated from West Point. The Buffalo Soldiers served bravely and loyally in 177 battles in American conflicts. Buffalo Soldiers were considered some of the most loyal, decorated servicemen in the U.S. Army. As a regiment, they demonstrated peerless bravery and were distinguished not only for their valor, but for their discipline. There were 13 enlisted men and 6 officers from these 4 regiments that earned the Medal of Honor, an award presented in recognition of combat valor that goes above and beyond the call of duty. In 20 years from 1870 to 1890, 20 Buffalo Soldiers earned the military's highest accolade, the Medal of Honor. It is well documented that the Buffalo Soldiers earned these achievements and accomplishments despite racism and poor conditions. They had the lowest military desertion and court-martial rates of their time. And although the majority of Buffalo Soldiers served valiantly, there were only a handful that were able to overcome racism to rise to the elite and recognized with distinction. Henry Ossian Flipper, born into slavery in Georgia in 1856 and attended Atlanta University, was appointed to West Point. He faced enormous difficulties due to hostility and intense resentment from the other cadets and officers. Flipper overcame these obstacles to become the first African American to graduate from West Point in 1877. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to the 10th Cavalry Regiment, becoming the first black officer to command soldiers in the regular U.S. Army. John Hanks Alexander was the second graduate of West Point in 1887, and in the same year, he was appointed commander of the Buffalo Soldier Regiment in 1887. Another Buffalo Soldier standout was Captain Charles Young, who was the 3rd African American to graduate from the United States Military Academy. At the time of his death, he was the highest-ranking African American in the U.S. military. Charles Young was also the first African American superintendent of a national park. Number 10. Buffalo Soldiers and Black servicemen and women leave us a rich legacy. Today, visitors can attend the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum in Houston, Texas, a museum dedicated to the history of their military service. Bob Marley and the Wailers immortalized the group in the reggae song Buffalo Soldier, which highlighted the irony of formerly enslaved people and their descendants stolen from Africa, taking land from Native Americans for white settlers. The Richard Allen Cultural Center in Leavenworth, Kansas, includes the home of a former Black U.S. Army soldier. The museum shares the histories of African Americans living on the Kansas frontier during pioneer days to the present, especially those serving in the U.S. Army as Buffalo Soldiers. In 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, eliminating racial segregation in America's armed forces. The last all-black units were disbanded during the 1950s. Buffalo Soldiers played significant roles in many other military actions. Mark Matthews, the last surviving Buffalo Soldier, died in Washington, D.C. at the age of 111 in 2005. The remarkable courage demonstrated by these proud African American soldiers in the face of fierce combat, extreme discrimination in the Army, deadly violence from civilians, and repressive Jim Crow laws should continue to inspire us today.
We appreciate the fact that you stayed with us until the end. Thank you for spending time with us, and don't forget to like this video. Also, make sure you subscribe so that you never miss a video. Bye for now. We will see you tomorrow.